I want to share with you a message this morning that I'm going to call Accepting Death and Living Life. Accepting Death and Living Life. So being away on vacation, we of course enjoyed ourselves and were in a good way distracted from all the normal chaos of life, just enjoying recreation and time with family and all those things. But because we're still living in a pandemic, we couldn't escape the reminders of that everywhere in the airports and as we went here and there in town, and all the restrictions and things that we're all familiar with now, kind of part of the new normal. So I've thought about, and really have for months now been thinking about the reality of our mortality and how this confronts us with mortality, our fragility as human beings. And I feel like there's a way we can be helped by just reckoning with our mortality. It can minister to us. It can help us appreciate the gospel, the hope of God. It can help us appreciate the heart of God. It can help us appreciate what it means to belong to God, to have the promise of eternal life. And so I want us to spend a little time this morning just kind of facing our fears. If there's one thing that we can all say we've experienced throughout the last, 6 months or so, we've all experienced fear, right? I mean, profound fear, sometimes crippling fear. You remember early on when news was just starting to come out that we were going to have to make some adjustments. I mean, at that time, we were being told things like, hey, this could kill upwards of 3, 5, 8% of the population, and maybe all different ages. And it was in the early phases of this thing, we didn't have a lot of clarity, and we were being told things like that. Do you remember hearing that it could be a danger to have packages come in from Amazon? Do you remember that? And people even were ordering their groceries and having them delivered to their house, but they were afraid to actually take those same groceries and eat them because they might be contaminated, and they were talking about the surfaces, and that could be an issue. I remember reading about the respiratory droplets. Like, we're all terrorized by respiratory droplets and how this thing could be in the air, and someone could breathe it into the air, and minutes later you could walk through this invisible cloud of air, and completely unbeknownst to you, you could contract COVID-19 as a result of that. I mean, the doom and gloom of it all was really, really difficult. It really was a terrifying time, and frankly, it's still very scary. We know a whole lot more now, but it's still very scary, isn't it? It is. So I want us to think about fear a little bit. Think about what this tells us about our nature, about our state. Naturally speaking, none of us are happy about our mortality. I mean, naturally speaking, we would want to live forever. We would want to, if we could be healthy, if we didn't have to age, right? We were talking about that earlier. Laura and I were talking earlier about some of the aches and pains of aging. And I mean, if we didn't age, we would probably want to go on forever. Just Sydney said, you haven't even gotten started yet. I know. Past 44 recently, and I'm already whining and complaining about the aches and pains. I ain't seen nothing yet, right? But none of us are happy about our inevitable and inescapable death. The reality is we are small, fragile, finite creatures. It's true, and there's help in accepting it, accepting death and living life. We can actually live life, I think, maybe a little better, maybe if we can accept death. 2 disclaimers, okay, before we get started. One, I am not, as you all know, I am not a medical doctor. I can say epidemiologist, but I am not one. I am not a virologist, nor am I a mathematician or a statistician. I like saying that too. I can say it, but I'm not that, all right? But I can look stuff up on the internets, right, Ryan? On the internets. I can look stuff up. I can read. I can plug it into a PowerPoint. I can't make it possible to actually advance my own slides on PowerPoint, but I can put the information on there. So I have limitations, okay? That's disclaimer number 1. Number 2, I truly do not have an agenda in terms of I'm not here to change your mind regarding how you're interpreting or making decisions in this climate we're living in. That is up to you. That's between you and God and your conscience and your family and your understanding of your own health and your own risk. That's in your court. My primary goal here is to just, in a good way, confront all of us with our mortality and help us just face it, that we might be encouraged in terms of who God is and the hope of the gospel. Now, that being said, as a secondary result, possibly, it may make you think. It may give you some perspective to think a little bit differently. And that's truly not the main point, but it might. And we'll see how it works out for each of us. All right, so here's where we're going. First of all, a little history and some comparisons. All right, so let's see if we can get slide 1 up there. There you go. Flu of 1918, you've heard of that one? It is called the Spanish flu. Affected largely young and healthy people under the age of 5, and then in that range between 20 and 40 years old. Killed approximately 675,000 people in the United States, and at that time, the population was around 103 million. So a long time ago, much smaller population. In terms of percentage of the population who died, 0.65% of the population died. It's a big deal. It's a lot of death. It's a horrible thing. All right, next slide. Flu of 1968. Some have referred to this as the Hong Kong flu. Killed approximately 100,000. Population at that time was around 205 million, so a whole lot more people than the early 1900s. 205 million. In terms of percentage of the population that died as a result of the flu of 1968, it was about 0.05% of the population. So 0.0005 or 0.05%. And in 1968, interesting, they took no drastic measures like we're seeing today. No shutdowns of businesses or schools. If there were, and there were some isolated shutdowns, but they were isolated and they were temporary. But nothing like what we're seeing today nationally and globally. So now a comparison. So the next slide. So that same flu of 1968, number of deaths I told you, 100,000 out of 205 million people. Percentage of the population deceased, 0.05%. This is where we are roughly with COVID-19 now. Okay, and even today, these statistics are a little bit outdated. I think we're over 170,000 deaths now. But as of the time I was compiling this, 169,000 deaths in a country of 330 million people. And what that amounts to in terms of the number of people in our population that have succumbed to COVID-19, it's 0.05%. Maybe it's a little higher. It's kind of it's estimated a little bit, or rounded a little bit. But it's similar to what was in the flu of 1968 so far. Now I realize more people are going to die. Okay, it's going to surpass the flu of 1968. But as of right now, it's on that same level. Okay, that's just interesting, right? Interesting. Okay, next slide. Now this is, and just to be as clear as I can, this is the flu, the everyday common flu that sweeps through annually. Okay, this is the flu compared with COVID-19. And unlike the statistics I just showed you, which were percentage of the total population that succumbed to it, this has to do with the death rate of those infected, okay, those who contracted the flu, okay? So the flu that we all know and dread every year, estimates say that it kills somewhere around 0.1% of the people who contract the flu. That's and broadly, ages, it's more broad in who it affects than COVID-19. So 0.1%. COVID-19, they estimate, and it's still unknown because of people who are asymptomatic and still not sure how many people have actually had it. But the best estimates give a range of somewhere between 0.26 and 0.8% death rate from COVID-19. Somewhere in that range. So as many as 0.8%, as few as 0.26%. And those of you who have been paying attention to the news know that even within that range, if you look at it by demographics, it's disproportionately affecting those in the older part of the population. So people over 65 years old, account for 80% of the deaths, over 65 years old. And of that group, most of them are over 80 years old. And then there's the issue of underlying conditions and other factors as well, race and other things, okay? So I don't want to get overcomplicated here, and I'm probably risking that already, but the point being that this is clearly worse than the flu, broadly speaking, though less risky than the flu for younger people. But broadly speaking, the numbers are more, if you're just looking at this, the numbers of deaths, okay? But here's what I want us to think about. Just think about this. One, it speaks to us of mortality, that these invisible viruses can come along and kill people. I didn't mention, I don't have it on here, but remember reading in school about the bubonic plague? Remember the Black Plague? That killed over 20 million people in Europe. At that time, it was in the 1300s. At that time, it was somewhere around 1/3 of the population of Europe died. I mean, so we live in a world in which that stuff can happen. I mean, is that scary? That is scary stuff. And it affects people, like with the Black Plague, of all ages. I mean, that is scary. To think that some invisible, microscopic virus can just take a human life. Speaks to us of our fragility, doesn't it? So I just want to think about this for a second. I mean, if COVID-19 is somewhere 0.26 to 0.8%, and the normal flu is 0.1%, I mean, what would it be for you personally? Don't answer, but just think about this for a second. What would it take for you to feel comfortable going back to life as it was in January or February? What would that number have to go down to? If it was 0.1% for the flu, and this is somewhere between 0.26 and 0.8%, where do you think you would be comfortable going back to what it was? And again, don't answer it, but just like it's just interesting to think about. And in the media, when they're talking about all these different things, they don't usually pose those types of questions. But it's interesting to think about. Like, how much risk am I willing to live with? I mean, again, they were saying initially 3%, 5%, 8% of the population. Well, we're in like 0.26%, which is 0.0026. Or at the worst, 0.8%, 0.008. I mean, it's interesting just to think about. And knowing that, okay, it affects older people more so than younger people, and that still a life is a life. I'm not minimized. I have loved ones I care about deeply that I struggle with fear regarding what would happen to them if they were to contract COVID-19. So I am not minimizing. I'm just saying it's just interesting that we live in this world with inescapable risk, and we've taken very drastic measures with the risk that, I don't know, when you look at the math, I mean, I don't know. I mean, is it warranted, all that's being done? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe for you it is. Maybe for other people it isn't. It's interesting just to compare, to take perspective. Another thing, just for perspective, that I wanted to look up, just life expectancy. So next slide. Life expectancy in the United States. In 1860, it was 39 years old. 39 years old. Life is hard back then. And people lived with that. And that was just sort of the way it was. And then you go on, of course, technological advancements, medical advancements, things improve in our country in a lot of different ways. 1905, around 50 years old. 1950, around 67 years old. That's approaching more what we would say is more normal, but that's still quite a bit younger than what it is today, which is 79 years old. So as that has increased, guess what happens to us humanly is we begin to expect, we feel entitled to a certain length of life. And that's why I heard gasps when I read that first one, 39 years old. I was like, what? Yeah. So just, think of what it tells us in terms of our fragility and our mortality, and how things have changed in terms of what we've been able to accomplish and how we've advanced, which are great things. And I'll say too, along with that, that's great that the fear that we have. I want to be clear that fear can be a very helpful thing. Like, we need fear, don't we, to keep ourselves alive. Like, there's a healthy instinct to keep ourselves alive, to preserve our lives. Keeps us from doing really stupid things, like running into the middle of the freeway or other stupid things, right? That we need to have that. But there's also a line between a healthy sense of fear that keeps us alive and an unhealthy sense of fear that just cripples and paralyzes us and shrinks our lives down to like nothing, to where we feel like the only thing we could ever do safely is just stay in our closet. I mean, somewhere is the line. And I'm not going to try to tell you where the line between healthy and unhealthy fear is. I don't know. But there is a line somewhere. And there's a line somewhere where fear becomes this enslaving, controlling thing. And it has something to do with our blinders to who God is and our pseudo-self-sovereignty and our obsession with preserving and prolonging our lives and our unwillingness to accept loss and to accept death. And so we end up working so feverishly, so tenaciously to preserve and protect and prolong our lives that we forget what it means to even be able to live our lives. So here we are, living in this situation, and we're, subject to the authorities, and, we have the ability to vote, but we don't have a lot of control. And again, our opinions and decisions aren't going to affect things broadly for the most part. And we're living here, and we have a lot of consequences. And it's been said, and you've probably heard it, the pathway to hell is paved with unintended consequences. And one person added, I heard it is paved with good intentions and unintended consequences. There's a lot of unintended consequences. I mean, everything we've talked about so far in our current situation is only with regard to COVID-19. What about the fact that I saw a political article the other day which said that 1 in 4 young adults contemplated suicide this past spring? 1 in 4 young adults. And the numbers aren't in yet, but the researchers say they estimate that most likely there's going to be many more suicides this year than 2019. So deaths due to suicide. Drug crisis on the rise, overdoses on the rise. You've heard about the opioid crisis. Many tens of thousands dying every year due to overdose and abuse of opioids, and that's going to only increase. And what happens when you strip people of movement and activity and goals and relationships and human touch? What happens when that goes on and on? It won't go well. And underneath it somewhere, and this is where we start to now, and I know this has been like a really long introduction, okay? But this is where we start to approach like biblical truth. Because underneath it, look, you remember Paul says, and I have it later on a slide, but I'm getting ahead of myself, where Paul in 2 Corinthians says, hey, beware of philosophies that rise up against the knowledge of God, that challenge the knowledge of God. There's a lot of lies out there that control and enslave us. And one of them today is that we can achieve like this utopia almost. That we can maximize health and length of life, and we can eradicate and eliminate every disease and every illness and every form of discomfort. And the reality is, even the ones we eradicate, a new one shows up, doesn't it? Like there's always something threatening to take us out. We can't escape it. But sometimes we buy into this mentality that we can. And we put our hope in, and I think we're all in some ways hoping for a vaccine, although I'm a little bit scared of the vaccine. But maybe a vaccine will come and it will eliminate this, and maybe it'll work for a while, then it will mutate, and it won't work anymore. I don't know what's going to happen with that. But once again, we're confronted with the fact that we just don't have control. Don't have control. We're fragile. We're mortals. There's a fascinating book. I've mentioned it many times. The author is Dr. Alan Francis. He was the chairman of the board of psychiatry at Duke University. Practicing psychiatrist and professor. And his book is called Saving Normal. And he is warning, as an insider, he's saying, guys, this is out of control. with, he calls it diagnostic inflation. We got to diagnose everything and everyone, whether it's in the medical industry or the psychiatric industry. We got to diagnose everyone because it gives us some sense, this delusion of control. And he said, but the reality is we are actually oftentimes doing more harm than good. With the measures we take, driven by our own humanistic pride, we're doing more harm than good. And we have tunnel vision and we overlook the devastating consequences of all these extreme measures we take with psychiatric medications and other types of medications and other types of things. And he quoted in that book the idea the pathway to hell is often paved with good intentions and unintended consequences. And there's a philosophy today that just, hey, this is, put your trust here in what humans can accomplish. It's kind of like the Tower of Babel thing, right? We can build to this place. I mean, frankly, that's rearing its head with the COVID-19 situation, and it's rearing its head with the whole racial issue in our country today and in our world today. Hey, we can get there. We can get to a better place. Okay, next slide. From the beginning, God has said to Adam and Eve, and this applies to all of us, he said, in the day you eat of that fruit, you will surely die. Right? Next slide, Ryan. Ezekiel 18:4, behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins will die. We will all die. Cannot escape it. It's going to happen. And ever since, there's been this struggle to survive. And as I said, there's some of that that's healthy and normal and good and keeps us going and protects us and protects our kids, and that's good. But there's also somewhere there's a line where that becomes all-consuming and a preoccupation and unhealthy and enslaving, and it robs us of peace and robs us of joy and dehumanizes us and shrinks our lives down and isolates us, and that's a horrible, horrible plague of its own kind. It's a crushing burden on us. God says you're gonna die. Jesus says in this world you will have trouble. Remember that? You will. It is guaranteed. You can't avoid it. He's pleading with you to accept it. That's part of the truth of who God is, who you are, and the world you live in, which He defines. He's told us everything we need to know. So a little bit more here of some examples, and this is the last one of just real life type examples or these type statistics, okay? But Ryan, if you bring this on. So again, I want that visually, like that should overwhelm you a little bit, all right, visually. This is you living in a fallen world. Another article I discovered, which just describes the chances of dying from different causes for the average American. All right? 1 in 6 chance of dying of heart disease, 1 in 7 of cancer, 1 in 27 of respiratory disease, 1 in 96 of opioid overdose. That's pretty high. 1 in 103 of a car wreck. 1 in 114 by falling. 1 in 285 by gun assault. A 1 in 556 chance of pedestrian incident, accidents to come time, being hit by a car or whatever. Motorcycle accident, 1 in 858. Drowning, 1 in 1121. Choking, 1 in 2618. Oh, okay, I just make the right choices and I avoid these places and I avoid these activities. Look, you got to eat. You got to eat, right? And you could literally choke to death. Like it could happen. By gun accident, 1 in 9,077. And just for fun, it's not on the slide there, but just for fun. Chance of getting killed by a shark, 1 in 264 million. But I'll tell you right now, every time I go to the beach, I think about it. Every time I'm out there enjoying surfing the waves, I love doing it, and it crosses my mind every time. And for the sake of my kids, too, they're not here, right, Jill? They'll never want to go again. Look, this is the world we live in. It's inescapable. There's so many different ways we can perish. I heard yesterday, somebody was driving down a freeway in the south, and a turtle came flying and went through their windshield. and thankfully lodged itself in the windshield. If it would have gone through, that probably would have killed the person, they said, because of the speed they were going. You could die by a flying turtle. Welcome to Earth. Jesus said, next slide, whoever wishes to save his life, and literally in the original it's his soul, will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. This, of course, has eternal implications, but I think along with that also has here and now implications. There's something crippling, enslaving. It's a crushing burden to have the weight of the responsibility for the preservation of my life completely on my shoulders. Now look, we can all make decisions in terms of our diet and things, choices we make to go places or not go places and to be wise and all that, and that is fully appropriate. And so in that sense, we do have some measure of control, but Psalm 139 says God's already determined the number of our days. It's already established. Ultimately, that's on God's shoulders. And the weight of preserving and saving your soul in any respect, physically, spiritually, you can't handle it. It will drive you mad. It will destroy you. It will eat you alive with fear and emptiness and guilt and shame and separation and resentment and judgment toward other people who you perceive to be threatening you. I mean, it will eat you alive. And Jesus says, but he who loses his life or loses his soul on account of me will find it. Mikkel read that Hebrews text where Jesus, knowing that we were enslaved to our fear of death throughout our entire lives, Jesus comes to this world. He lives as a mortal being. He lives in a fallen, fragile world. He accepts his death at the worst possible form of it, being betrayed and executed wrongfully. He accepts it, and he does it in our place. And he says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will never die. And he goes on to say, he will live even when he dies. Even when we die, we still will live. We will live beyond this fragile world where you get maybe 79 years. Give or take. He offers hope. I would love to, in my natural way, okay, and I'm just going to start to land the plane here. But in my natural ways of thinking, I would love to be able to just go to the beach without thinking about some of the dangers of going to the beach. We were there this time. I wasn't so much thinking about sharks, though it does always cross my mind some. But I've got 3 little girls out there swimming around the ocean, and I'm like, okay, I just want to make sure they're okay. I'm always looking over, and I got 3 people I'm trying to make sure are not drowning, right? I love to live in a world where you go on a roller coaster or a plane or drive fast or do this and not have to fear of what could happen if things go wrongly. I would love to live in such a world. So would you in some respect, but we don't live in that world. We don't. We are all forced to live with risk. And we don't often consciously assess it, but sometimes we do, but a lot of times we don't. But the reality is we are always, always living with risk. And there is a philosophy and a worldview in our day that just says, hey, put your trust in what we can do, and then you can really secure a life for yourself. And it's a complete and utter lie. The truth is, you are mortal. You're going to go. You have a limited number of uses of your eyes and your ears and your nose and your senses, and a limited number of times that you can hug your spouse and play with your kids. A limited number of times. And one of the things the gospel tells us and what it invites us to do is to accept our mortality. Accept that is true. Accept it as a gift. Accept, as it says in James, that life is a vapor that appears for a moment that vanishes away. Psalm 90 says, teach us to number our days that we might present a heart of wisdom. To know that there's a finite number of them. To hear Jesus promising eternal life, promising resurrection. It says in Colossians, set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth, for you have died already, and your life is hidden with Christ. There's a God of love and mercy and grace who knows our fear. He sympathizes with all our weaknesses. He understands. He's not condemning you. He's not condemning me. He forgives. He has mercy. And he says, hey, just accept what's true. Accept that I have you. That even when we die, we'll be raised with Christ to life anew. Finally, a perfect, whole, complete world with no more threats, no more dangers, in union with our God and with one another. So, those are some thoughts about the current situation. Frame them in terms of the gospel. I hope it helps you as it's been helping me. I'll say, as we've said so many times, hey, look, I'm available to you. Love to talk to you about these things. If it's made you think, if it's kind of perplexed you or even offended you in some way, I'm happy to talk about it. Happy to talk about what you're experiencing and how you're interpreting things and decisions you're making and share with you my perspective. And then we all just kind of proceed forward, right? In God's grace together, in the love of God for us. And trusting that He'll show us the truth of who He is, and He'll reassure us of His gospel and the hope we have because of Christ. So I hope that's encouraging and helpful to you. Next week, we'll be back in Ephesians. Looking forward to that. Thankful for Greg covering for me, doing a great job while I was gone, and Donald covering Sunday school, and thankful to be back with you guys, and look forward to talking with you in just a second. So let me pray and close us. God, thank you for the time we've had this morning. Kind of a unique type of message that you allowed me to share. And with all that information, all that data, God, I pray you'd help us to understand, to discern, to accept the truth, to accept our impending death. And even though we don't like it, don't look forward to it, but to accept it, and along with that, to find a sense of gratitude and joy because of your love and forgiveness and because of your promise of resurrection, hope, new heaven, new earth. Help us to live in light of those things. Help us, God, to not fear for tomorrow, knowing every day has its own trouble. Thank you so much for coming in the person of Jesus to live in this fallen world so that we are not alone. We are not without you. We are not without hope. We are not ultimately in the hands of ourselves or any other human supposed expert, but that we are in your hands, the omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God. Thank you for that truth. Thank you for the work of Christ that made it all possible. And I pray again that you'd help us to remember these things and to walk forward wisely. In Christ's name.